We've been talking about the 1950s, and the last couple of lessons have really focused on what it meant to have some prosperity, moving to the suburbs, advertising, medical technologies, corporate issues, work. But what we want to show you is that in this case, it's not entirely going to be all prosperity. Lots of Americans still are going to be remaining poor. Lots of them are still going to live below the poverty line. We're going to see all kinds of issues like tax bases in cities begin to collapse, and the cities themselves begin to collapse and become poor. You're going to see all kinds of issues that really target the poorest of the poor in our society and those that are often mistreated or neglected, including African Americans, Mexican immigrants, Native Americans, and even the poor in Appalachia, which is a region of America. So what we're going to start here by taking a look at this is that when it comes to how people respond to prosperity, it's that even in the 1950s, we're going to have poverty amid that prosperity, that not everywhere we go will we see people necessarily living in great prosperity. Because in the 1950s, a lot of Americans are still going to be impoverished. 1 out of every 5 Americans is going to live below the poverty line. That line that we have, it's called a poverty line. It's kind of an imaginary line, right? The government says anyone above this line that makes more than this, they're not poor. And anyone that's below this line, well, they are going to be poor. And there's all kinds of poverty lines. There's poverty lines based upon the minimum needed to support a family of 4, a family of 5, whatever it might be. Lots of these poor are going to be single mothers, they're going to be elderly, they're going to be ethnic minorities. You're going to have all kinds of people that are really kind of struggling with this issue of poverty. Let me show you what I mean in terms of kind of what that line looks like. In 1950, if you had a family of 4, it was $11,490 if you had a family of 4. That's your poverty line. Anything below that, you're impoverished. 2015, that line is $24,250. That's that kind of poverty line that we're seeing people at in America. The average middle class salary for a person right now in America, like the middle of the middle, is right around 50 grand. That's pretty much where that is. So a substantial amount there. And the poverty lines today, they're not what you might think, right? So if it's just one person living in a household, if you make less than $11,000, you're impoverished. If it's 2 people, it's 15,000, and so on down the line. And you can see what that looks like here. But what you need to take away from this is that in no way, shape, or form is this issue of poverty really something that's going to go away. It's always going to be with us throughout the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. I want to show you a couple of things here. I want to show you the poverty rate versus the number of people in poverty. And what you can see is that the poverty rate in the 1960s and 70s continues to decline, and it remains relatively low. But what's interesting here is that the number of people that are in poverty, that doesn't remain low. And what you need to remember is that this is important. There are different ways to count poverty. In fact, do me a favor and write poverty on a slip of paper tomorrow and bring that in. That's the word I'm going to want to collect from you tomorrow, poverty. There's different ways to count poverty. So while we'll see a poverty rate of around 15% on this slide, we might see a poverty rate of around 30% if we're talking about children, or 40% if we're looking at people that are in poverty for a part of the year. There's just lots and lots and lots of different ways to count poverty. When it comes down to nations, for example, if you look at a certain kind of way of counting poverty, you'll see America has a poverty rate of 21, almost 22%. So there really is just a lot of different ways to take a look at where and how people are considered poor. But the bottom line, the takeaway from this is that America experiences a great number of people in poverty starting in the 1950s, and that's going to continue up to today. And one of the reasons that that's going to happen is that our cities are going to become increasingly poor. As the wealthy and the middle class move out of cities to the suburbs, they're going to leave behind the poor. Well, the poor don't pay as much in taxes. When the poor don't pay as much in taxes, it gets harder and harder to take care of the city, whether it's education or public transportation or libraries or housing or hospitals. It becomes increasingly difficult This is what urban decay looks like. This is modern day Camden, New Jersey, one of the cities in America that has the most urban decay. It has a population primarily of impoverished people. And because of that, it is unable to keep its infrastructure going. And you can see what that urban decay looks like. The American government is going to try and respond by doing something called urban renewal. And the idea here is that we're going to build low-cost housing, we're going to tear down slums, and we're going to allow people who lived in those slums to move into this low-cost housing. Here's an example from Southwest Washington, D.C. in the 1950s and 60s. You can see a lot of these apartment high-rises right here, and all of these places will now include the impoverished. And this is a really big deal because I want you to think about, for tomorrow's lesson, what's going to happen to these areas when you move a large number of impoverished people into one region. And I want you to think about that in terms of work, in terms of education, in terms of crime, and so on and so forth. I think a really good image to kind of show you what this looks like is one that comes out of St. Louis. This is a 1950s, 1960s housing project in St. Louis, and you can see what they attempted to do. We have here a whole series of slums that will be torn down and removed, and we've replaced them with all of these apartment buildings. And again, the same concept applies. Think about what happens to the neighborhoods as you concentrate poverty in these particular locations. Another way of looking at this, ladies and gents, will be right here. Here we have a city and its taxes. As long as the population is here, we have wealthy, we have middle class, we have impoverished people, our tax base is good. Well, what's going to happen here is that over time, the middle class and the upper class will move out, and that population will lower, as it's just the impoverished. And as a result, the tax base will lower, making it harder to take care of these different places. Now, as I mentioned before on the last slide, lots of Americans are still going to remain poor and below the poverty line. Mexican immigrants are going to be one example of that, but there's many others that we're going to see here, because prosperity doesn't change everybody's lives in the 1950s. There are clearly some categories of Americans which are going to be doing worse off, or not nearly as well as white America. And you can see them here, the African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, and those who live in Appalachia. Rural white Americans aren't going to be doing as well either. So what we're going to see here is that for African Americans, as an example, we're going to see a whole series of African Americans move from the south to the north in that Great Migration. But that's not going to necessarily result in better wages and a rise out of poverty, because the racism and the discrimination that was in the south has brought with them up there to the north. So what we'll end up seeing is that through the 1950s, even as white pay rises 2 or 3 times, an African American at the time is only going to earn half of what a white man earns. So even as white pay rises, black pay is not going to rise enough, keeping African Americans impoverished through the 1950s and into the 1960s. It's going to be something that Martin Luther King's going to take a look at. Hispanics are going to be arriving in America due to the Bracero program, and what we're going to see there is as white Americans move into these white-collar jobs, as they go off to college, as they return and move to suburbia, we're going to have a large need for farming in America. So we're going to encourage Mexican Americans to move north and take these jobs. The problem is, even though we have all this immigration from Mexico, we're going to have Mexican Americans working kind of out of sight and out of mind, right? We can't see the problem. We can't see the fact that they work for a little pay. We can't see the fact that they work in terrible conditions. So we don't do anything about it. And of course, you always even have to ask yourself, knowing what we know about American society, even if we did know something about it, would we necessarily do it? Something similar could be said about Native Americans. By the middle of the 1900s, by 1950, Native Americans are the poorest people in the United States as an ethnic group. There is no doubt about it at all. The reservations are incredibly impoverished. There are no jobs to be had. Education is completely lacking. Alcoholism runs rampant. It is a mess. So the American government's faced with an option, a decision it has to make. We either help Native American reservations, get the industry, get the mineral rights, get the education, get the supplies they need, or we just get Native Americans off the reservation. Now remember, under the New Deal coalition, FDR's goal was to try and give more control of those reservations to try and make those reservations a better place. Now what we're going to see under Eisenhower in the 1950s is he's going to say, it's not working, we got to do something else. We're going to pass something called the termination policy. We actually withdraw our recognition of Native American groups as legal entities. We say, the Mohegan tribe, you don't exist anymore. Oglala Sioux, you don't exist anymore. You are not your own legal entity. This means that you aren't guaranteed protections on those reservations that you used to have. You need to leave those reservations and go find work and a life someplace else. A great example of this here, as we see people leave, would be this little chance here in Denver. And look at this, right? It's so right out of the 1800s with immigrants coming to America. If you move to Denver, right, what are you going to find? You're going to find a great job, right? You're going to find a happy home. You're going to find training. And Colorado is just this beautiful place to be. And I love this one right down here. Did you see this? Mild winters. Mild winters in Colorado, where the gigantic snowfall is. So we're going to see Native Americans go to these cities, and the living conditions will be terrible. We're talking tenement-style living conditions from the early 1900s. Life expectancy, for example, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, for Native Americans, 37 years old. If you meant 38, you were living longer than the average Native American was in Minneapolis. It is an incredibly difficult time for Native Americans. The same could be said for Americans living in Appalachia, which is the region of America that runs along the Appalachian Mountains. It goes from Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, Pennsylvania, on up into New York State. In Appalachia, a lot of mining, a lot of farming. The problem is, in the 1950s, as the mines in America became more and more mechanized, machines were used to mine instead of people, people begin to lose their jobs. This leads to an incredibly high rate of poverty in Appalachia. And when you have an incredibly high rate of poverty, and this image right here, folks, is from the 1950s, not the 1870s. When you have an incredible high rate of poverty, you're not going to have services because you can't afford them. Doctors, education, schools, hospitals, and so on. So life in Appalachia is going to become extraordinarily difficult. Now, I don't want you to think that urban America was without its difficulties in this time of prosperity, in quotation marks. It's not the case. There were challenges there, too. And some of the challenges that happen there in the urban areas deal with the juvenile delinquency. And the juvenile delinquency is this issue where the young people cause all of the kinds of ruckus and they get involved in the crimes and are committing the terrible types of activities and they're putting the hurt on all kinds of people. And the problems that we have there simply cannot be ignored because the young people are rising dramatically with their juvenile delinquency. A 45% increase in only 5 years from 1950 to 1955. The juveniles are being completely reckless. So what do we see? Well, we see a lot of Americans worried about this juvenile delinquency, but there's not a lot of answers as to what was actually going on behind the scenes to cause it. Was it television that everyone was watching, or the movies, or was it racism? Or perhaps too many young children didn't have religion, or they weren't being disciplined at home. Perhaps they were simply bored or impoverished. Maybe there was anxiety over the draft. I don't know. Hans doesn't know. But what we do know is that most of the Americans said that school is the solution. If we put the kids, the juveniles in school, then they can't have all of this trouble. But this problem is that doesn't help. The reality is it doesn't solve the problem. And it still doesn't solve the problem. But it is the first time that the problem is identified as something specifically for juveniles and a problem that has to be addressed specifically for juveniles. And we're going to continue over the next 40 years to try and figure out what to do with juveniles and juvenile delinquency. So that'll be enough for today, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow in our lesson.